Tytti Erästö, who will be the first speaker. She's a senior researcher at SIPRI's mass destruction program. Sounds like something very dramatic, yeah. With a focus on issues related to control of nuclear weapons, disarmament, etc. She has, I will reduce it, you can read it yourself. She has formerly worked with the Plowshares Fund in Washington, D.C., and at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. If there's anything you want to add, do so. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's called Weapons of Mass Destruction Program. It sounds bad. It was previously a program for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. A long story, but yeah. Not mass destruction. So yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm very grateful. It's the most amazing conference location that I've ever been to. So my background is in nuclear arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Been working for SIPRI now for 9 years, and before the Ukraine war, we at SIPRI's nuclear WMD program. We were mostly focused on nuclear armed states and relations between them, and also on potential proliferators or nuclear proliferation crises, with the focus usually always being away from our own region. But as you know, in recent years, the regional tensions here have highlighted nuclear dangers in our own backyard. So that's why we at SIPRI, or in our program, we're also looking at developments in Northern Europe and the Arctic. And I would argue that nuclear escalation risks are particularly high in this region. So in what follows, I'll be explaining why I think this is the case, and explaining what I see as the major drivers of nuclear risk in the region, and also what could be done about it. I see that my outline is missing the last part, but it's about risk reduction measures. So to get to the risk drivers, of course, this session is focusing on the Arctic, but it's hard to distinguish between the different regions. So the security and escalation risks in the Arctic are closely connected with the broader conflict we're having with Russia. So on the one hand, this context, the security context, is shaped by NATO-Russia relations and tensions between them. But on the other hand, though linked to the NATO-Russia relations, there is the bilateral US-Russian strategic relationship, or their relationship, which is defined by nuclear deterrence, which is impacting nuclear risks, and our region, conflict in our region is impacting that relationship in what I will argue in a negative way. So I'll start with the NATO-Russia relations, which, as you all know, have been really bad for the past 4 years, and there are several risk drivers related to this regional conflict, and one obviously is the general risk of escalation related to the Ukraine war. The Russian nuclear threats made in connection with that war were aimed mainly to deter NATO from getting involved in the war. And while NATO countries are not directly involved, as you know, they are very much indirectly involved, and their continuing support for Ukraine does still contain the risk of horizontal escalation, meaning that the scope of the conflict could still, in principle, expand to involve more actors and also other European subregions. There is also the risk of vertical escalation, meaning at worst nuclear escalation, even though thus far Russia hasn't lived up to its previous nuclear threats, despite the fact that its red lines in Ukraine have been crossed many times. And I wanted to provide a quick overview of the military balance between NATO and Russia, because I think that's one factor that is actually increasing nuclear risks or lowering Russia's nuclear threshold. And that has to do, with the fact that despite all the talk about the NATO, our need to build up and counter the Russian threat, when you look objectively and compare military capabilities, NATO, even without the US, is overwhelmingly superior to Russia. So in all the categories of major conventional weapons and military expenditure, all categories, NATO is far beyond Russia. Only the number of reserve military personnel in this comparison exceeds Russia a bit, but not in such a significant way. So these numbers are from 2024. I counted this with the help of. I'm focused on nuclear weapons, but I have I have colleagues at SIPRI who are experts on conventional weapons, arms transfers, military expenditure. So they helped me with finding the data, which is actually based on IISS figures. SIPRI just looks at military transfers and expenditure, but IISS looks at the capabilities that every country has. So the problem is that their figures are not publicly available. They are behind a paywall, and there's so much information that it's sometimes a bit too hard to find the relevant information. But the point here is that if there would be a conflict between Russia and NATO, the danger is that if Russia feels like it's losing, it might be tempted to compensate for its clear conventional inferiority with nuclear weapons use. So in this sense, the whole NATO response of trying to counter Russian nuclear threats by boosting its military capabilities even further and boosting also nuclear capabilities, it's not really solving the actual problem. It might just be making it worse. And
excuse me, may I ask? It was NATO Europe. Yes. Does that mean without Canada too?
I took out Canada and the US from the comparison. Too. So the asymmetry is even bigger if you would include them. But that's more.
What you showed was only Europe and.
That's European countries. Turkey included also, so of course.
Is including US.
Yeah, but I took it away because So this is the title is actually a bit wrong. It should be European NATO and not Russia here. Yeah, sorry. So this is again about the overall European security situation, but it's again indirectly related to the Arctic, as any large-scale military confrontation between NATO and Russia would impact probably several sub-regions, and especially if there is nuclear escalation, then that doesn't respect any boundaries. So anyway, to go back to the previous slide and the other risk drivers. So apart from the Ukraine war, as you have also noticed, the Ukraine war has triggered this, but we also have local tensions and conflict dynamics that have developed like a life of their own. The heightened threat perceptions have led to large-scale militarization, including more frequent and large-scale military exercises. So again, rising tensions and increasing the risk of incidents. And we have already seen several close encounters between NATO and Russian forces. And as in the previous previous panel already, somebody mentioned the EU oil sanctions against Russia, and that is indeed one big driver behind these tensions. And as you know, these sanctions have given rise to the so-called shadow fleet problem, and now we see NATO countries boarding tankers carrying Russian oil, and then the Russian military kind of trying to protect these tankers. So this is pretty dangerous. Although most of these kind of incidents are taking place in the Baltic Sea region, they too involve escalation risks that might have implications beyond that sub-region. So the risk here is that these local, lower-level incidents could lead to higher-level escalation, possibly as a result of misperception or accidents. If somebody gets killed, for example, if an aircraft is downed, for example. And these risks are heightened by the lack of communication channels between European countries and Russia. I mean, there are communication channels, at least at the diplomatic level, but the military-to-military communication lines are, as far as I'm aware, they are mostly not working. Norway is an exception here, but of course that doesn't help the Baltic situation. And of course, to come back to the Arctic, the situation is better there than in the Baltic Sea, or it's not as tense there, and I'm not aware of any boarding of tankers carrying Russian oil there. So the tensions are a bit lower there, but there have been military incidents related to, for example, the US strategic bomber overflights, to which I will come back a bit later. So, but another risk driver that is more relevant to the Arctic and also nuclear escalation risk is crisis instability in this region. And I would argue that the most concerning development regarding nuclear risks are actually taking place in the Arctic. And rather than the risk of general war between NATO and Russia, these developments have to do with the bilateral US-Russian nuclear deterrence relationship. And a key consideration here now and also during the Cold War was the presence of Russia's strategic nuclear-armed submarines in the Kola Peninsula and in the Arctic waters where they operate. So, yeah. So strategic nuclear submarines, which are kind of considered by all nuclear-armed states who have them as the most survivable nuclear delivery vehicle because they can hide underwater and they are difficult to detect and to destroy. So these capabilities thought to be essential for preventing or deterring a nuclear first strike. That's why these countries, nuclear-armed states, are so put so much importance in these kinds of systems. So SSBNs, strategic nuclear-armed submarines. And the possibility of inadvertent nuclear escalation linked to these sea-based nuclear assets in the Arctic, like I said, has been long recognized since the Cold War times. And already then, the Soviet concerns about the survivability of these SSBNs were seen to create so-called use or lose pressures that could, in the worst case, lead to a preemptive nuclear strike. Please interrupt me if I use some terminology that should be clarified. SSBN, just the same thing as the strategic nuclear-armed submarine. I mean, this, nuclear-armed submarine. So, what does it mean? I will explain it soon, but it's anti-submarine warfare. So it's like weapons and capabilities that can detect these submarines when they are underwater. So these concerns about the survivability of these sea-based nuclear assets that can lead to the lowering of nuclear threshold and to a preemptive nuclear strike that I just mentioned. And in the nuclear jargon, that problem is known as crisis instability. So use or lose pressures basically means facing the choice of either launching nuclear weapons or not launching them in a situation where the adversary strike against these systems seems imminent. And I would argue that this same old problem of crisis instability that was recognized already during the Cold War has not only re-emerged, but it has been worsened or exacerbated in the current context because of several new developments. And one of these developments has to do with Nordic states' defense policies and conventional military buildup that has followed Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the Nordic countries and the governments, they all view their own defense policies as defensive by nature. So their goal is to deter and counter any potential Russian aggression. Unfortunately, these decisions are also having unintended consequences for the bilateral US-Russian deterrence relationship or strategic stability in that relationship. And these consequences, I would argue, remain very poorly understood in the Nordic countries and Europe more generally. One factor here is the bilateral defense cooperation agreements, or DCAs, which have provided the US access to several military bases in the Nordic countries, and especially in the Arctic. So about roughly 1/3 of these bases are located in the Arctic. So this means that US presence near the Kola Peninsula, where Russia has its strategic assets, has increased. And at the same time, Nordic countries, along with other NATO allies, are investing in advanced conventional weapons, notably precision strike missiles. So these are conventional weapons that can, often cruise missiles that can fly very long distances deep into the Russian territory. For example, the Joint Strike missiles carried by Norwegian fighter jets and the JASSM-ER cruise missiles procured by Finland would be able to reach deep into the Russian territory when launched from the F-35 fighter jets. And Norway is also investing in new anti-submarine warfare, ASW, capabilities, including underwater drones, which is another way that Russia probably sees as threatening because these can, these capabilities, alongside with the US ASW capabilities in the region, they can detect Russian nuclear armed submarines, or SSBNs. So this increased militarization and US presence in the region is of course seen by the Nordic governments and allies in terms of enhancing regional defenses. However, from the point of view of the bilateral US-Russian deterrence relationship, these kind of capabilities and increased US presence in the region can be seen to add to US damage limitation options, another term that basically means destroying the adversary's nuclear weapons or otherwise neutralizing them so as to prevail in a nuclear war. And of course, in these days, such a capability might sound great to many. It also undermines the strategic stability in the US-Russian deterrence relationship, which is based on mutual vulnerability to nuclear threats. So this might actually increase the risk of nuclear war, especially during crisis. And here it should be recalled that the Russian threat perceptions not only have to do with recent developments and NATO enlargement to the Nordic countries, to Finland and Sweden, but they have long been shaped by prior technological developments, especially the combination of US strategic missile defense development and the US conventional deep strike capabilities. So Russia has long viewed these as a threat to its nuclear deterrent and also an obstacle for arms control, because yeah, it's a longer story, but basically Russia thinks that as long as strategic missile defenses remain unlimited, then it can't go lower on the number of offensive nuclear warheads. And while the Nordic and allied capabilities, like these deep strike weapons or anti-submarine warfare capabilities, they are probably not really incorporated into US nuclear war planning. Strategic threat perceptions always tend to reflect worst-case assumptions, and we can assume that this is also how it's seen on the Russian side. And actually, a few years ago, some Russian experts pointed to the possibility that Russia might respond to massive deployments of these conventional deep strike missiles in Europe by moving towards a more preemptive nuclear doctrine. So the risk here is not just nuclear escalation starting from a so-called limited nuclear strike, but this could go straight to a higher level of escalation in the worst case, although the threshold of nuclear weapons use remains very high. And here I would also mention the recent developments in the Ukraine war, where Ukraine has attacked Russian strategic assets like nuclear early warning radars, the strategic bomber bases. I mean, on legitimate grounds, Russia is bombing Ukraine all the time, and the bombers have also been used in conventional missions. But from the point of view of strategic stability and nuclear risk, this is problematic because the previous taboo on ever attacking these systems have been broken. Like the assumption used to be that if you attack this system, that automatically means nuclear war, like a nuclear armed state would respond with a nuclear strike. And now many in Europe are noticing that Russia hasn't really responded. I mean, it has responded through conventional means, but some have drawn the conclusion from this that we could also strike Russia's strategic targets during a war with Russia, and that's pretty dangerous because I think the Russian response would be very different if we're talking about a conflict between nuclear armed states or between Russia and a nuclear armed alliance. So to summarize, potential damage limitation capabilities are increasing while the taboo on targeting nuclear delivery systems and related infrastructure has weakened, which has undermined strategic stability, meaning increased risk of large-scale nuclear war, in addition to the risk of potential escalation starting from Ukraine or other local conflict. And then more bad news, because most of these developments that I was just talking about have to do with non-nuclear weapons, with conventional military buildup. But at the same time, we have also seen a new pattern of nuclear signaling in the past few years. Of course, the most visible example that we've all heard about are the Russian nuclear threats, the rhetorical nuclear threats in the context of the Ukraine war. And this, I mean, Russia has kind of brought all of this about itself because this talk has been a major driver for militarization in Europe. But the recent allied NATO operations have also involved unprecedented nuclear signaling, which is not just rhetorical, but mainly operational, which might be even more dangerous. For example, 2 years ago, the US B-52 bombers flew in Finnish Lapland, very close to the Kola Peninsula, near the border with Russia. And last year, the same aircraft type conducted a bombing exercise just about 100 kilometers from the Russian border, and again near the Kola Peninsula, where the strategic submarines are based. And the 2024 overflight also led to a close encounter with Russian fighter jets, which came to the scene to intercept the US strategic bombers. So this kind of signaling is really provocative. And yeah, as I said, it's one of those incidents that have happened in the Arctic that has probably gotten less attention than the incidents in the Baltic. It also represents a marked shift from the past when Allied activities in the High North were restrained by Norwegian national guidelines, which, as you probably know even better than me, that they were lifted last year. So earlier, no Allied aircraft were allowed in the easternmost part of Finnmark, and this was demonstration of sensitivity to exactly the kind of strategic stability concerns that I just mentioned. But these restrictions have started to lose their meaning, or they start. I mean, you know the Norwegian discussion even better, but I think the Finnish accession to NATO was a major factor that made them lose their meaning, because Finland has even longer border with Russia and it doesn't have similar restrictions. And as you see, it has allowed not just any Allied aircraft to operate near the Russian border, but also the US nuclear-armed or nuclear-capable strategic bombers. You have 5 minutes. Oh, I hope I get to the risk reduction part, but we can talk about it later. So another factor what has made these Norwegian guidelines to lose some of their previous significance is exactly the kind of technological developments that I also talked about earlier, because when you have these long-range deep strike conventional weapons, it doesn't really matter if you're close to the border or not, because these missiles might reach targets deep inside Russia anyway. So proximity is less of a factor these days, but it's still psychologically very provocative to do to these kinds of operations near the Russian border. So the end of the policy of restraint seems to be over, and this is also reflected in the Finnish legislation. Maybe I'll skip that part and we can talk about it later, but you might have noticed that the Finnish government proposed getting rid of the previous legislation that banned nuclear weapons in the country, and the parliament then accepted this. So this is sending another signal to Russia that there's little policy of reassurance anymore to balance deterrence. It's all about deterrence, and in my view, it's just, even if you believe in deterrence, it's just not very smart to deploy nuclear weapons near your adversary's border. And of course, everybody's saying that the idea is not to deploy nuclear weapons there only during crisis, but that's the most dangerous part. So, yeah. So I guess I don't have so much time to talk about risk reduction, but 3 minutes. So I think the first step towards risk reduction would be a change of mindset, because we have these Nordic countries that go to the NPT conferences, to multilateral conferences, and they make all kind of statements supporting nuclear risk reduction. But what they actually mean there is like cooperative efforts or unilateral efforts by nuclear-armed states to do something. So the responsibility is on them. But when it comes to risk reduction in their own region, the Nordic countries are doing very little. Again, I would say Norway is an exception here, because it still maintains some bilateral and military-to-military channels with Russia. But I think, especially for the other Nordic countries, there's a need for a mindset change, and of course the difficult part here is that risk reduction means talking to the adversary, and nobody wants to talk to Russia these days. But I think this attitude is not really serving the European security interests. And then there's the assumption that Russia is not interested in risk reduction; it just seeks to manipulate risks. But there is a difference in how Russia behaves in Ukraine and how it behaves in northern Europe or the European Arctic, for example, where it's like many others have pointed out that its goal seems to be to maintain the status quo in these regions. So I think it would serve our interest to recognize this. Then modest risk reduction steps, apart from changing the mindset, is track 2 dialogues that was also mentioned, like exchanges among experts would be needed. And it's difficult these days. We at SIPRI, we would like to organize meetings with Russian officials, but we face obstacles all the time, both on the Russian and European side. So if the governments would change their mindset, they could facilitate this kind of dialogue. And then another step would be to revive the existing confidence building and transparency mechanisms, like the more formal track 1 dialogue. Sorry, I didn't get to talk, but we can talk about the rest of the risk reduction steps, but at least I got to outline the problem.
Explain what is track 1, track 2.
So track 2 means experts. Discuss dialogues among experts. Track 1 means official level. Track 1.5 is like a mixture between the two, like you might have some officials in the room. So I think all of these would be needed.
Okay, thank you. I announced that we would have the. I think I can take only 3 or 4 questions. I can see 3 hands by now. Okay, 4. Finished. And we had Susanne. We had who was it over there? Somebody over here. Yes, Susanne.
Thank you, Tytti, for the lecture. I have a question because I'm excited about having somebody from SIPRI here in the room at our conference. I wonder, being an activist in WILF, how is the collaboration between the experts in SIPRI and the peace movement? I think we could be much stronger if we would have more collaboration. What do you think about that?
We'll take all questions together.
Yeah.
Over there?
No.
Yes?
So can we use the microphone,
Yes,
please,
yeah.
everybody?
Thank you very much. Very informative introduction. I would like, first and foremost, can we have some links to some of the material that you actually showed here underlying your speech? It is very important, and I appreciate very much people who do this hard, exacting work of finding out. And then, of course, the rest of it is then we'll try to make some sense out of this for the practical world. First and foremost, what you've shown in very much detail is actually that NATO is now trying to realize the RAND report from 2019, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground, which means showing an aggressive, forward-leaning attitude, signaling intent of surrounding them. In the Baltic, in the north, in Black Sea, it's very easy to see when the documents are there. Second, it also shows, in my opinion, that we need to take a different course. You showed introductorily, very briefly said that the Euro-NATO, which I call the European part of NATO, have about 3 times, formally at least, the capacity of Russia. And that's only technically. So I just wanted to say we need to start the discussion based on these facts. And that's why I also would very much like to have some of the sources. You don't need to provide them all, but some sources on the basis of your introduction. Thank you.
Please be short. We do not have more than 15 minutes for this. We have this over here and then.
First, thank you for a good presentation of your research. My question concerns communication and based on risk reduction scenarios and risk decreasing. So I wonder, is there in your research indications of the level of communication, the baseline level of communication between Russia and northern countries? And what is there possibilities of continuing your research, monitoring changes? You described lastly deterrent incidents, and is that you can stretch it to that's a form of communication or a possibility of communication, but it's basically like a threat. But how this changes over time, and is it any way to develop this back into more constructive communication?
You probably already touched upon some of this. Is it possible, in a very short way, to conclude who provokes who in the Arctic?
Thank you very much. Now you have the floor again.
Is this working? I think not. Maybe.
You can use this.
Yes. Yeah, on the civil society, like we are in touch at SIPRI with the Swedish, the WILF and the Svenska Läkare mot kärnvapen quite frequently, and we invite each other to each other's events. So but we could probably communicate more. I'm also, in touch with Laura, or especially this year, I ended up going to many events in Finland because of the legislative debate around the legislative change. But yeah, there would always be scope, I guess, for doing more. And the links I'm happy to send if you specify, for example, if you're interested in the military balance thing, that is a bit hard information that is surprisingly hard to find. So it was part of a report that I wrote like 2 years ago about the role of nuclear weapons in military alliances. It's a bit hidden in the middle of the report, but that was part of it. And about the RAND report, I haven't read it, but now I'm curious to read it. So I wouldn't want to say anything about it before reading it. But I mean, it does seem that at least it can be. It's very easy to see why Russia would think that this is the aim of NATO, although I think that the Nordic governments, for example, really believe that they are acting defensively, but they might at the same time be advancing some plans that some in the US might have for reaching supremacy. And yeah, like I said suggested in the nuclear domain, that does seem like the US is after supremacy. And that also reminds me of what somebody said when we had a workshop on risk reduction and talked about the need to restrain arms raising and so on. Then somebody posed a question saying, why stop arms raising when we are winning? So I think that was pretty telling. Then about the risk reduction, the communication, if I understood your question correctly, it's a bit hard to know what communication is actually going on because nobody wants to admit that they're having any communication with Russia, and probably most people are not having, but there are some behind the scenes communication, like for example the the hotline between Norway and Russia, and the US has always, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US has always maintained a hotline with Russia. Like, okay, there's hotline between, it can be hotline between leaders, but now I'm thinking, and what I was suggesting is that there needs to be hotlines between military headquarters, and at least, and this is not like information that it's easy to find, but after talking to Finnish officials, I heard that they are talking at the, defense attaché level, but not really military to military communication, which would be needed in these kinds of incidents where things are happening fast. And then there are these things that I didn't have time to discuss, like these Cold War model agreements, like incidents at sea agreements, the prevention of dangerous military activities agreements that the US has with Russia, but these incidents at sea agreements also some other countries have, including Norway and the UK, and I think these would be useful if other NATO countries and Nordic countries would also conclude these agreements, or as some others have proposed, there could be a multilateral NATO-Russia incidents at sea agreement. And yeah, I think, and about the question about who provokes who, it's more like a chicken and egg problem. I wouldn't dare to answer that. Thanks. About the well, when it comes to nuclear issues, which are my area of expertise, it is the US and NATO that are provoking Russia, because imagine if Russians would come so close to US strategic submarine bases, then you would get the Cuban Missile Crisis again. It's extremely provocative, and I don't think most Europeans really understand it. So, yeah, there it's more clear about general military activities. I don't know, but also I think many of the things that Russia does in terms of conventional military capabilities in the region and the submarines that are not nuclear armed, it's about protecting the submarine bastions. So in that sense, the tendency to view any Russian military activity as aggressive, it's a bit misleading, because in the Arctic it's pretty based on maintaining the status quo and being defensive. It's another thing. They are aggressive in Ukraine. You all know what they have done there, but I think it's important to draw a distinction between different regions. I hope that was better.
Thank you very much. I will continue, or we will continue with Sindre, who has not put his name on his PowerPoint, but you have informed us about a number of things about yourself. You are a political scientist with a master degree from Oslo. You have a bachelor degree from London School of Economics. And not least, and important in this context, you have a degree from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where you lived and studied for several years. So I take it you speak Russian, and you have written in your presentation on the website, which you can read yourself, some more information. But you have written a master thesis on Russian think tanks and the High North, Strategic Narratives on Norway and Arctic Security, 2013 to 2025. And you're the first student to investigate how Russian think tankers present Norway as a security actor in the northern areas. And you're also an activist, as I understand, and a member of the Norwegian Peace Union. So please, we look forward to hearing you. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a very, very good introduction. And obviously, I'm also very grateful for the invitation. It's been an absolutely amazing experience to come here and see the Institute and nature, and I meet so many interesting people. Yes, I'm going to present a paper that I wrote on strategic narratives in Russian think tanks about Norway, and especially then as an actor in the High North. My interest in this topic comes partly from, as you mentioned, my background. So I finished my bachelor degree in international relations at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. That university is closely linked to one of Russia's oldest and most influential think tanks called SWOP. It's the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Studying there also introduced me to the internal debates in the strategic community, and also watched how several of the predictions made by my professors were later vindicated, such as warnings that Russia would invade Ukraine if the West wasn't willing to negotiate on the demands put forth by Moscow in December 2021. So now we've talked a lot on this conference about the profound changes that's going on in the High North. I think it's important that domestically in Norway, there is now a lot of people that argue that we have to abandon Norway's previous dual approach towards Russia due to these changes. This debate is also based on different sort of assumptions about what drives Russian foreign policy. So if Russia is driven mainly by fear, then we should keep reassurance, right? But if they're driven by greed or expansionist motives, then we should enhance deterrence. The debate also hints on risk calculations or assessments. You know, how probable is it that the probability for unintended escalations in the case that we abandoned our sets of self-imposed restrictions. So in order to choose the right strategy, one has to try to understand what drives Russian foreign policy. And that is a very difficult task. Russia is a closed, informal, and authoritarian political system. Many experts claim that Russian narratives are propaganda. However, there's now been an increasing amount of scholarship and also calls within the academia to move beyond Putin-centric explanations and to take seriously sort of the domestic roots and ideas that structures Russian foreign policy reasoning, including the intellectual ecosystems and think tanks. Laurel, for example, a French scholar, calls think tanks in Russia for narrative entrepreneurs. Many of them also have direct access to policymakers. And so several scholars then have concluded that they do in fact have an impact on Russian foreign policy making. For that reasons, then when I then was going to write my master's, I saw that there hadn't been any previous research done on how the strategic community views Norway nor the High North. So that was sort of the gap that I aimed to close. In my paper, I analyzed 60 publications made by 3 different Russian think tanks. RIKE, Russian International Affairs Council, which was established in 2010 by a presidential decree, And SWOP, which was established in 1992 by Caragano, who also happened to be the dean of my faculty, and he also worked as an advisor for both both Yeltsin and Putin. And then lastly, the Izborsky Club, which was founded in 2012 by a circle of intellectuals around Prukhanov, in a way, sort of part of the counter movement to the protest that was going on against Putin. When I analyzed these texts, I used a theoretical framework which combined Tsigankov's idle-type triad of Russian foreign policy tradition with strategic narratives. So, according to Westernism, Russia is a European country, but an underdeveloped country. The solution they propose is closer collaboration and integration with Europe. Statism, on the other hand, focuses on, the anarchy in the international system, and also argues, in basis of Russian history, that Russia needs a strong state, a sovereign state, in order to secure its territorial integrity and wealth. While civilizationism, they're very esoteric. It's kind of strange, a little bit like reading maybe like Rudolf Steiner or Carl Smith. But they argue that that Russia is its own unique civilization, which is in an enduring conflict with the Atlanticist axis. And then strategic narratives. They are stories that legitimize its policies, right? And their success depends on the coherence between three different levels: system level, which is what the world is; identity level, who we are, who they are; and then the policy level, that is the concrete prescriptions that are arrived from the two prior levels. When I then read the text, I coded for metaphors, historical references, causal claims, etc. And I also examined the extent to which they think or argue that Norway is an autonomous state, or is a sort of used pawn, or has limited autonomy, and also the compatibility between Norwegian national interest and Russian national interest. So the first finding concerns changes over time in the narratives. Izborsky, which isn't very surprising given that it is the most ideological think tank, does not change. They always claim Russia is this unique civilization in conflict with the Atlanticist axis. However, the narrative do change a lot for Reich and SWOP, based on their prior sort of perceptions of the international system. So, and that also shapes how they interpret the different events. For example, SWOP had previously argued that Russia should diversify its economy from Europe, and they saw the sanctions that was implemented against Russia in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea as a confirmation of that. Reich, on the other hand, argued that the sanctions showed that Russia needed to cooperate closely with Europe because they weren't able to actually find any other partners that could offer the technology that Russia needs, and also because the realization of the Arctic project depends upon good relations with Europe, including the Northern Sea route. In the first period, it's important to notice also that SWOP even argued that Norway was actually the country that has the most common interest with Russia, because they also argued that Norway, they have huge stakes in the Northern Sea route. They also would then be able to diversify their economy, to invest in Russia's project, etc. Then, as tensions increased, they also explained those tensions differently. SWOP argued that Russia purely acted reactively, like that the United States was basically driving the militarization in the Arctics, which was sort of a leakage from a new Cold War between Russia and China. Reich, on the other hand, criticized that and argued that Russia itself was actually spurring militarization through its policies, which was threatening the small states' interests, like who then answered. In this period, there was also a debate about the identity of Russia. Swap increasingly argued that the Western states were no longer reliable, including Norway, and they argued that Russia should sort of embrace this Eurasian identity, something which Reich greatly opposed. Finally, then, when the war broke out in Ukraine, that was sort of course, a major change. Previously, the leading experts of SWAP, they hoped that it would be possible to come to a negotiated settlement with Europe on arms deals on Ukraine. But when that did not happen, they concluded that they hadn't understood the extent to which Europe lacked strategic autonomy and also was degraded. They used many harsh words.
What is SWAP? What is REACT?
Those are the two think tanks that I mentioned in the introduction. As you see, I also put it on the slides.
So quickly.
Okay, sorry. There's a lot of materials. I have to try to speak perhaps more slowly. But those are, as mentioned, two different Russian think tanks. Reich is the Russian International Affairs Council, while SWAP is Foreign and Defense Policy Council, and they're both think tanks in Russia. So both of them are Russian think tanks. Yeah, that's correct. That's important. I thought that I mentioned it several times already. But then, when the war in Ukraine then finally commenced, I mentioned that. But Reich, on the other hand, they criticized many of their leading experts. So statism became perhaps more even influential in that period than Westernism, but a big Westernist strand remained, and they criticized the Ukrainian war, and they argued for normalization, basically, with Europe. I think the three schools, Westernism, statism, and civilization, you could say that in the text there are recurrent themes, and they then uses the history as evidence sort of for what Norway really is. So they interpret the border history differently, the Second World War, the Pomor trade. I remember that in the car, Einar told me that now there were some criticism concerning the Vardø festival in Norway, that someone suggested that we should change the title because it was pro-Russian. But as you can see here, for example, Izborski, they claim that the whole Pomor narrative is itself invented by Norway and the West to create separatism and regionalism in Russia and to annex sort of parts of Russian territory. So I think it would be a great idea to invite to debate representatives from guys who study history from Izborski and our friends who want to change the name of the Pomor festival because they think it's pro-Russian. But so, the different theoretical frameworks sort of leads to different assessments. So how much autonomy Norway has and what is Norway's national interests. This is sort of the bridge that then shapes the concrete policy recommendations. As we've seen, Reich, they still actually wants to normalize relations with Europe, and they uses Norway's policies as sort of evidence that may be possible. They point to the fact that despite having limited autonomy, Norway has used its maneuvering space to at least keep some of the self-imposed restraints, and also selective corporations, also, for example, scientifically in the Arctic Council, and which leads them to arguing that, okay, what we should do is try to negotiate with NATO on self-imposed restrictions, and that could be an alternative to purely military actions. They also argue that they should pursue collaboration and cooperation wherever possible. It's telling how the three think tanks interpret, for example, similar events such as the Svalbard cargo restrictions in 2022, where Norway basically refused or did not let Russian boats go to Barentsburg. They were going to deliver food, amongst other things, due to the sanctions. And Kortunov, then leader, he was previous leader of RAEC, argued that, for example, incidents was purely of a technical nature and should be understood as a technical nature. Nobody is interested in a conflict over Svalbard, right? And Russia should also treat it as a purely technical issue. SWAP, however, they don't agree with that at all. They think that after 2022, there isn't any point whatsoever about even talking about Norwegian interests, because they argue that Norway is only a pawn. They don't even follow their own national interests. That means that there aren't any point in negotiating with Norway. What you should do is try to change sort of the calculus of NATO as such, amongst other things, by making the Norwegian leaders aware that if Norway is used as a provocation against Russia, Russia will respond with tactical nuclear weapons if necessary. So they suggest complete change in the military doctrine. They also argue that it is not much point in cooperating with Norway, because that would only legitimize the hybrid war against Russia. And they also even then debates whether or not Russia should exit the Arctic Council. But importantly, most of them seems to arrive at the conclusion that the Arctic Council, that membership should be maintained in the Arctic Council, also because then one could possibly build leverage against the Western countries. Lastly, then we have Izborski. And tellingly, like Suslo, for example, who is a senior member of SWAP, interpreted the same Svalbard supply crisis as a sign that a new use-led Arctic front is already open. So you see that there is they're very coherent between the different levels of narrative, and also how they interpret the different events. Lastly, we have Izborski, who claim that Norway do have autonomy and they do pursue their own national interest, only that those national interests are completely in contradiction with Russia's, because Norway's economy is based on oil, on gas, on fisheries, which again is also depends upon control over territories in the north. So they claim that Norway simply exploits tensions between the west and the east in order to secure control of territories in Barents Sea and or Svalbard, which they claim actually were stolen from Russia. That Norway sort of exploited Russia when they were weak in order to capture Svalbard and large chunks of the Barents Sea. And Izborski says that Russia has to get those territories back. So we hope that those guys maybe don't come to power in Russia. That would not be cool. Yes, so they even opposes, for example, UNCLOS, that is the UN laws on sea. So what follows from this? Well, I think that at least in Russian debates, self-imposed restraints, they are all, and restrictions, they all obviously still matters. As we see in Reich bases their whole sort of argument on the fact that Norway still have some self-imposed restrictions, that there are still selective cooperation going on between Norway and Russia. If we then were to abolish all self-imposed restrictions, then we would also, in a way, abolish Reich's argument because they at least they had to invent another new arguments. It would also confirm the more hawkish claims in Russia that there are no space for negotiations anymore, and that the only option is to change the nuclear doctrine and militarization and to take coercive measures. It's also important that across the whole field, even the experts that criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that believes that Russia bears responsibility for the current high tensions in the Arctic and the militarization, even they argue that there are some complete red lines that if they're crossed, it may lead to unintended escalation, to accidents, and to disaster scenarios. And they include, for example, military presence on Svalbard, and also expanded military activity in eastern Finnmark. For example, in some of the scenarios where they imagine that a war could occur in the high north and the Arctic, in many of those cases, the reasons for that was then military presence on Svalbard, which they believe could trigger, for example, war. Then also there is this argument that's been used a lot in Norway, also on especially on the left, in, for example, the Socialist Left Party and on the Red Party, made by Høyre, that if Norway increases, actually that long-term plan, forsvarsforliket, that the Russian experts and Russia sort of supports that, because then Norway, if Norway have more military capabilities, if we have a higher military budget, we will be able to take responsibility over our own security. That could then decrease American presence, something that Russians would like. But that is not at all how the long-term military plan is interpreted by Russian experts. They, on the contrary, see it as sort of as evidence now that you have this Nordic integrated bloc and part of NATO that are being developed, which would be capable of conducting multi-domain operations and so forth, to then consolidate control in the north. So I think this is conclusion. I think one important thing is that it seems that most Russian, at least if we were to base on the think tanks, debates within Russian strategic community, it seems that Russia still sort of aims to normalize, or at least to get the Arctic Council working again, which is a good thing, which means that there still should be possible, at least, for cooperation. Yeah, that was thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You even left us some time for discussion so that we can manage for the 1 o'clock lunch. I think I will again take 4 questions and leave the discussion, or the rest of the time for you for discussion. 1, 2, 3. Okay. 4. Fine. Thank you.
I make maybe it's because I'm old and I take time to catch things, but it seems that not even from your part, which explains the Russian view, or about the others' interventions, it has not been mentioned the origin why Russia attacked Ukraine. It's because also this feeling of being surrounded by NATO bases, which NATO has also a responsibility. For them, it was Ukraine was the last limit where if there was also Ukraine becoming a part of NATO, then they would be completely surrounded. So it was their limit. So why is not that mentioned?
Please, I think we will take all questions, so if you can note them down, it'll leave us more time. I think you had the question, and you?
Yes, it's two documents, military documents, that's been agreed upon from all the political parties in the parliament. And the one is Forsvarskommisjonens innstilling og langtidsplanen for Forsvaret. I don't know how to say it in English. And yeah, long times planning. And in these documents, it's said that Russia and the China is the main enemy, and besides Russia, and that Norway will play the leading role in an Arctic flanke, also Arctic military force in the north, in the Nordic country, in a future war between, against Russia and China. And since these documents have been agreed upon politically, they have, of course, then decided to build up our defense and all. They are planning according to these documents. So I think we have a problem talking about dialogue because it's already been agreed upon by our politicians that they don't want a dialogue. They're actually planning for war.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for interesting presentations. I have two questions. One about the Russian official and unofficial nuclear strategy. Do they openly or unofficially plan for a limited nuclear war? A low-scale nuclear war or something. That's the one thing, and the other question is the kind of debate there is between these think tanks. Is this reflected at all in the public debate in Russia or in the parliament?
Thank you very much. I think the last speaker was over here somewhere. It's not Julius. Was it you? Yeah. There was nobody over here apart from this who came later.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. In the beginning, you mentioned that Russia had some demands for about how to operate with the Ukraine problem. What was the main demands or claims that they had?
I think that was a very short question. So if you can have a very short question, you can pick.
Yeah, I'll be very short. I want to thank you for an extraordinary, very, very good presentation. I think that it's extremely rare that we have a possibility to see the world from a Russian perspective. We never do, and you really made it possible for us. Thanks a lot. So I have to be very short. I'll make a very short question. The chair was mentioning that you're also a peace activist yourself. You're a member of a peace organization in Norway. So do you see any kind of strategy that the peace organizations could have in order to contribute to small steps in the right direction? Do you see any small steps from the peace organizations? Thank you.
Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Yes, concern the reasons for the Ukrainian war, and I'll guess then what the different think tanks said about it. Well, I didn't mention it because it would make my presentation too long. That was the only reason. But SWAP, of course, they claim that it's again the fault of the United States, and that Europe, despite not actually wanting to have a confrontation with Russia, sort of just because have still ended up still refused to negotiate with Russia due to their leaders, which they claim do not have the same interests as their country. They claim that Europe is degraded. They claim that it does not have any strategic autonomy from the United States. It claims, so sort of that is their explanation. But they do see the war as simply as defensive, as reactive against United States imperialism and so forth. While Reich, for example, do not view it like that, and Izborski again see it sort of as a civilizational war, which is a view that has become much more now common in Russia. Actually, 2/3 of the Russian population, they see the war as a civilizational war. And even SWAP have later adopted that sort of rhetoric from Izborski and the more hardline news. So about Forsvarsforliket, or the long-term defense plan, that's something that all of the Russian experts points out, and they even also highlights sort of which recommendations different think tanks from the United States have given Norway. And then they underline that Norway always sort of later then impose all of the suggestions from the US think tanks. And they even also now compare, sort of, they argue that, okay, why hasn't the United States attempted to do anything in Svalbard? Well, that's because Norway already does everything that the United States demands, while the Danish, they haven't done almost anything. During the first presidential administration, Trump said, like, listen, you guys have to start to do something about, like, the security situation in Greenland. And then they were going to implement a defense plan. But when Trump then became president for the second term, they hadn't actually realized any of the plans from the first period. So that's something that they point out. And concerning Russian nuclear strategy, I think that you probably know a lot more about that. But yeah, it is now, you have a very sort of public, polarized debate in Russia. That's happened also on Russian television and so forth, and Russian media. There is this scholar Matthew Galeotti who also studies Russian, and he claims sort of that Putin permits this, and he hasn't really taken any side yet. He's waiting, seeing if Russia can deal with the challenges that they now have, the recent attacks and so forth, and based on that, they will probably take a position and so forth. But Karaganov himself claims that he has a lot of support now for his nuclear deterrence strategy. And Russia have indeed changed their nuclear doctrine. Also, I was talking about the demands in December 2021. I don't remember all of them, but I think they also included like that NATO should pull out forces from the Baltic Sea, that they should promise that NATO wouldn't expand anymore. It was about also, I think, long-range missiles in Europe, those things. And Russia said that if the West did not accept them, then they would respond with a military technical answer. And my professors, they were at least convinced that that Russia would go to war against Ukraine. And I didn't think a lot about it at the time, but later, of course, that was they did that. And about the peace strategy, well, I think maybe at least Reich, those guys have some points about that. It's important to maintain sort of low-level cooperation. People-to-people contact, especially I think science, for example, work with urban indigenous population in the Arctic, climate change, search and rescue missions, to maintain at least and the red lines, the contact lines, hotlines, sort of those things, but it's a very, very difficult questions. But I think things like the Varde festival in Kirkenes, it's important to still maintain some sort of contact across the borders and cooperation probably.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can stop on time. Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations and for bringing these detailed views to all of us. So that